Opening the center, d4 immediately fights for central influence and opens diagonals for pieces. Immediately preparing to challenge white's central pawn, this opens avenues for queenside development. Developing the knight here aims for central control and prepares kingside castling, offering flexible options for white's pawn structure. Developing the knight to a central square reinforces black's pawn structure and prepares for future pawn breaks. Developing the bishop to f4 actively contests the center and prepares for castling, forcing black to address the diagonal's pressure. Boldly challenging white's central pawn with a pawn thrust, black initiates dynamic pawn play and opens lines for their pieces, seeking counterplay. Fortifying the center with e3 solidifies pawns and opens diagonals, preparing for queenside expansion while subtly limiting the bishop's scope. Securing queenside development while potentially preparing a fianchetto, this pawn push aims to challenge white's central pawn structure. Securing the knight on d2 aims to bolster the central pawn chain and prepare for queenside expansion, a flexible approach. Solidifying piece development, this aims to connect the rooks and prepare for castling, a sensible continuation towards king safety. Solidifying the center's pawn chain opens avenues for queenside expansion later. Securing the monarch now allows for freer development and potential counterplay against white's developing pieces. Solidifying the center and preparing for eventual pawn advances, white's bishop now eyes the kingside. Exchanging pawns here opens a central diagonal, potentially offering your bishop greater scope and challenging white's pawn structure. Opening the e-file immediately challenges black's queen and opens lines for white's pieces to develop harmoniously towards the center. Developing the bishop to the active outpost *ba6* immediately challenges the established pawn chain and prepares to trade off white's strong light-squared bishop. Sharpening the central pressure while forcing black's bishop to a less ideal square. Solidifying the queenside pawn chain while opening a diagonal for the dark-squared bishop offers valuable defensive and offensive potential. Castling secures the king and prepares to connect the rooks, a fundamental step in consolidating the position. Repositioning the rook to the e-file now eyes the weakened light squares and prepares potential central advances. Reinforcing the central pawn and preparing for potential central pawn breaks creates dynamic tension. Retreating the bishop to f8 allows for pawn advances on the kingside later, but sacrifices immediate counterplay and central presence. Challenging black's queenside control by creating pawn tension and potential space gains along the entire wing. A subtle repositioning of the queen, preparing to contest the c-file and potentially support a d5 push. A dynamic regrouping. This queen repositions to bolster the kingside and potentially support a central breakthrough or flank attack. Bringing the bishop back to its starting square aims to resolve white's kingside pressure and prepare for potential central pawn breaks. Sharpening the initiative along the queenside, white forces a decision on the file, aiming to exploit any weaknesses black might concede. Developing the knight to d7 prepares for potential d5 or d5, aiming to solidify black's central presence. Opening that a file immediately forces black to decide on the bishop's placement, potentially disrupting their queenside development. Opening the file presents dynamic possibilities for both sides, demanding careful piece placement and strategic maneuvering. Seizing the open file offers immediate tactical clarity, simplifying the position and potentially leading to an advantage. Recapturing the rook opens the a-file, creating dynamic imbalances and preparing further activity. Preparing a kingside pawn storm, but it might overextend the king's defenses too early. Reactivating the bishop to the c6 square creates a diagonal influence, aiming to disrupt white's central control and potentially open lines for future attacks. The bishop repositions to support the queenside advance and target the e5 square, subtly enhancing white's queenside space. Shaping a new diagonal for the bishop, g6 prepares to contest the kingside's aerial pathways, but potentially weakens dark squares around the king. Rerouting the knight to the kingside offers better attacking prospects and consolidates central control. Targeting the central light squares, the queen now aims to penetrate the kingside via the f3 square, a promising offensive maneuver. This repositioning of the bishop aims to contest control of the c6 f3 diagonal, potentially disrupting black's pieces and preparing for central advances. Reclaiming the bishop's outpost on d5 strengthens black's control over the crucial central squares. Shifting the knight aggressively to c4 aims to pressure black's queenside pawns, while opening lines for white's remaining pieces. The queen retreats, relinquishing central influence but preparing for a potential queenside expansion. Repositioning the knight to a more centralized and active square, aiming to exploit the weakened kingside or secure better piece harmony. A bold repositioning, the rook now eyes the queenside with renewed ambition and potential for deep infiltration. Repositioning the knight to e3 aims to reinforce the kingside and prepare for potential pawn advances, though it concedes some central influence for now. Repositioning the bishop to a more flexible square, where it can potentially support a queenside pawn advance or defend the kingside. This aims to create central control and pressure on black's queenside pawns. Bypassing the knight's protection, black redirects the queen to a more active square, preparing to challenge the center and potentially create counterplay on the d-file. Unlocking the queenside is the aim, preparing for pawn advances and potential infiltration. Seeking to reroute the knight to a more active square and possibly prepare a queenside pawn advance. Liberating the bishop from its defensive post prepares to contest the long diagonal and potentially unbalance the pawn structure. Developing the bishop allows for better control over the crucial dark squares and prepares for potential queen maneuvers. Reclaiming the queen from the flank opens up possibilities for a central pawn push, potentially fracturing black's carefully constructed defense. Re-establishing the knight's presence on the queenside initiates a potential regrouping for pressure. Exchanging the bishop simplifies the position, aiming to exploit the doubled pawns and potentially activate the queen. Recapturing the pawn with the knight initiates a strategic re-evaluation of the central pawn structure and opens up dynamic possibilities for both sides. Exchanging bishops clarifies the center and simplifies white's pawn structure for the ensuing middle game. Reclaiming the bishop immediately solidifies central control and prepares to activate the knight. Steering pieces towards the queenside could unravel black's structure. Reclaiming the bishop to reinforce the kingside and prepare for potential pawn breaks adds vital dynamism. Shifting the queen to attack the weak pawn on b6 targets an isolated weakness and pressures black's defense. Expanding on the queenside, this pawn thrust aims to dislodge white's bishop and open avenues for black's pieces. Reasserting pressure on the queenside, this maneuver aims to dislodge the rook and potentially create new attacking avenues. Reclaiming the active square for the bishop opens up new attacking avenues, potentially targeting white's compromised queenside. Recapturing the pawn, white seeks to exploit the open queen's diagonal, aiming to disrupt black's pieces and control key squares. Provoking a tactical skirmish, this gambit seeks to disrupt white's knight outpost and open lines for counterplay. A timely repositioning, seeking to alleviate the pressure on the queenside pawns while maintaining a watchful eye on the central dark squares. Relocating the knight to f6 prepares to contest the e4 square and potentially target weaknesses that might arise. Expanding along the queenside now creates additional pawn chains for white to exploit later. Initiating knight activity from the flank often signals a desire to disrupt quiescent lines or eye-distant targets. Strengthening the king's haven by bolstering the pawn wall offers a robust defense against potential infiltrations. Shifting the queen to the center aims to improve its central influence and prepare for potential pawn pushes. Centralizing the queen creates multiple threats while aiming to exploit the open lines. This maneuver aims to consolidate the knight on its advanced square, potentially eyeing a future sortie towards e4 or f5 while defending against any immediate knight incursions. A daring knight sortie, threatening to unravel black's pawn structure and potentially exploit the weak dark squares around the enemy king. The rook now finds itself exposed on the back rank, a potential target for swift tactical retribution. Refocusing the queen to the kingside initiates a subtle pressure campaign. Bringing the king closer to the center offers a surprising safety net amidst this complex tactical dance. The queen repositions, eyeing potential pawn advances or a retreat from the knight's influence on the queen's side. Repositioning the bishop to d5 aims to create a strong central outpost and pressure on white's queenside pawns. Targeting the black king's shelter with a sudden royal check forces a concession, opening avenues for further infiltration. Relocating the king to h8 shores up the back rank, preventing any immediate checks along the 1st or 8th ranks. Shifting the queen aims to provoke a reaction and potentially exploit the now slightly exposed dark squares around black's king. A patient repositioning, preparing to contest the vital file that white recently opened. Reinforcing the king's safety is a wise precaution given the open diagonals. Opening a path for the bishop, this pawn push creates a dynamic pawn chain, aiming to disrupt white's king's safety. Shifting the knight to e3 opens lines for the queen and allows for potential pressure along the d-file. Seeking to untangle the pieces and perhaps launch an attack along the central files, qf7 now aims to connect the rooks and activate the queen. Reorganizing the knight to a better square prepares for future piece maneuvers and pawn advances. Opening the center with this pawn thrust creates dynamic pawn chains and potential attacking avenues for black's pieces. Unburdening the d4 pawn frees up the piece's mobility for future central activity. Repositioning the queen to a more active diagonal, threatening to exploit the weakened pawn structure. Reactivating the knight from its passive post, aiming to challenge black's controlling knight on d5 and stir up the pawn structure. Unlocking the center's potential, this pawn pushes to seize crucial space and activate pieces. Seizing the open files to pressure the weakened kingside becomes paramount. Opening a diagonal for the queen and creating space for the king to escape the pressure. Asserting dominion over the d-file opens avenues for a decisive central pawn push. Seeking shelter for the queen from that oppressive queen's diagonal and preparing a potential advance on the kingside. Initiating a king hunt after the rook exchange, this check forces the black monarch out of its protective pawn shield and into the open. Seeking an outpost for the knight, hoping to finally unblock that light-squared bishop. Probing for weaknesses in black's pawn structure with the knight's repositioning. Repositioning the rook offers central influence and prepares to contest the open files. Simplifying the position with queens off the board often favors the side with more active pieces. Repositioning the queen to eye the central weakness and potentially prepare for an exchange creates a new dimension of play. A strategic repositioning aims to contest the central square and prepare for pawn advances. Shifting the queen to f7 activates the piece for potential mating threats and supports the central advance. Shifting the queen to the 7th rank aims to disrupt the knight's defense and pressure the kingside. Repositioning the queen to f6 aims to prevent white's knight from entering the kingside and potentially supports a pawn advance. Controlling the central squares and preparing to penetrate the opponent's weakened kingside is the goal. Re-establishing a central defensive presence, the queen seeks shelter from the knight's aggressive advance, preparing for a potential pawn push. The knight's repositioning subtly aims to exploit weaknesses on the kingside and prepare for future pawn advances. Unleashing the knight's potential by disrupting white's pawn structure and aiming for queenside space. The queen retreats, relinquishing the initiative and allowing black to consolidate their central pawn push. Reasserting pressure on the d-file, seeking better pawn structure and potential breakthroughs. Repositioning the queen allows white to maintain pressure and prepare for potential pawn pushes on the kingside or center. Prioritizing piece activity, the queen seeks better squares to coordinate an attack or improve defensive posture. Repositioning the rook to the open a-file now aims to create new avenues for attack along that crucial pathway. Unleashing a pawn storm against the unsuspecting king, aiming to shatter the defensive shield. This rook repositioning aims to unblock the g-file and prepare for a swift assault on the queenside pawns. Protecting the rook from the formidable discovered attack, while also creating a potential outpost for the knight on the c-file, presents a challenging dilemma. Recapturing with the knight stabilizes the center and prepares to contest the d-file, a crucial avenue for penetration. Unleashing the pawn, a desperate gamble for initiative amidst static pieces. Unleashing the knight to this active outpost finally challenges black's central control. This pawn push opens critical diagonals, creating immediate pressure on white's d-file and offering counterplay. Exchanging queens simplifies to an endgame where black's connected passed pawns become a significant threat. Exchanging the bishop simplifies the position, paving the way for potential pawn advances and a more open game in the endgame. Eliminating the knight opens up the crucial e-file for pawn promotion and creates threats. A desperate attempt to salvage material after the crushing queen trade, but the king remains exposed. Unlocking the rook's potential on the open file is crucial to capitalize on the queen's sacrifice. The knight's recapture aims to solidify the pawn majority on the king side, hoping to activate the stranded king. Unleashing a pawn to open a vital line for the rook, aiming to exploit the exposed king. Reclaiming the central pawn frees up the knight for vital defensive duties. Unleashing the rook to pry open the f-file, aiming to exploit the exposed black king.